Welcome to the Human Archive. If you enjoy original science fiction stories about humanity finding its place among the stars, subscribe and join us for the next one. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Champion. Dr. Quilra Demez had watched 31 species reach exhaustion. They did not all fail the same way. The Cathari became disoriented before their muscles lost force. The pale-blooded Veln slowed gradually until voluntary movement simply ceased. Her own Avaric species developed a deep neurological torpor that could become almost impossible to resist. The Drazhen were different. They failed beautifully. Quilra watched Hroth Vakkel cross the final ridge of the previous year's Galactic Continuance Trial with 46 hours of exertion behind him and almost none of it visible in his stride. His breathing remained controlled. His hydration markers were excellent. His core temperature had barely moved from its normal range. The competitor behind him was less fortunate. A Saravan named Atroth had matched Atroth for most of the event. Atroth was brave, experienced, and physically powerful. None of that mattered when his protective neurological threshold activated. Quilra saw it happen in the medical data before Atroth understood. Voluntary motor output dropped sharply, stress chemistry fell, his gait shortened. He took 3 more steps, then his knees folded. Medical staff entered immediately. Atroth was conscious, but he could not force his legs to work. He tried. His body refused. Quilra crouched beside him while a medical platform slid underneath. "There is no injury," she told him. "Your shutdown response has engaged. Stop fighting it." Atroth gave one exhausted laugh. "Tell that to my legs." "They already know." The platform carried him away. Atroth crossed the finish threshold 11 minutes later and became Continuance Champion for the 11th consecutive year. He visited Atroth in recovery. Quilra expected celebration. Instead, Atroth stood beside the Saravan bed and offered a respectful bow. "You pushed farther than anyone else this season." Atroth flexed his toes experimentally. "My body disagreed." Atroth's dark, plated face softened. "Eventually, the body tells the truth." Quilra approved. She had spent 26 years studying endurance medicine, and she considered that sentence almost clinically precise. Every species possessed limits. Quilra's entire specialty existed because endurance contests could become dangerous long before competitors looked dramatic. The continuance trial therefore used continuous telemetry, mandatory medical reviews, species-specific withdrawal thresholds, and immediate intervention authority. Winning mattered. Preventing an exhausted athlete from converting stubbornness into organ failure mattered more. Evolution did not care about pride. When continued activity became more dangerous than stopping, healthy physiology took the decision away. The organism survived. That was good design. 3 months later, the Continuance Committee informed Quilra that humanity had qualified for the championship. She opened the Human Medical Archive. 20 minutes later, she reconsidered the phrase good design. Chapter 2. Human endurance is boring. The human was disappointing. Quilra had expected drama. Humanity was new enough to interspecies athletics that every competitor arrived surrounded by stories. Humans could run absurd distances. Humans climbed mountains for recreation. Humans worked emergency shifts long after sensible organisms would rotate crews. Humans had historical traditions involving marches, expeditions, fasting, vigils, military watches, industrial disasters, wilderness survival, and an alarming number of activities performed voluntarily while sleep-deprived. Quilra expected their representative to resemble a myth. Renee Halberd looked like a tired rescue worker. That description was closer to the truth than the broadcasters realized. Renee had spent 14 years in wilderness and orbital search and rescue, where the glamorous part of endurance usually happened after somebody had already made a scheduling mistake. She trusted checklists, calories, dry socks, short rests, and the unheroic discipline of stopping small problems before they became emergencies. She was 36 years old, medium height for a human, compactly built, with dark hair cut short enough that it could not interfere with equipment. The qualification footage began. Renee entered a terrain course behind 3 faster competitors. The others ran. Renee walked, not slowly but efficiently. When terrain opened into a flat section where speed mattered, she jogged. When the route steepened again, she slowed before fatigue forced her to. At the first recovery station, another competitor spent the entire permitted interval standing and watching the clock. Renee sat down. She removed her shoes, checked her feet, drank, ate before appearing hungry. Then she lay flat on the floor and closed her eyes for 4 minutes. Quilra replayed that section. She sleeps. The human medical liaison beside her shook his head. Not really, she downshifts. That is not a medical term. It is among rescue crews. Renee continued. She stretched before a climbing section, adjusted clothing before entering a cold chamber, wrapped a pressure point on one foot before it became a blister. When competitors received a 6-minute delay during equipment reset, Renee sat against a wall and stopped moving. Nothing about her performance looked heroic. She simply refused to waste anything. Atroth watched the same footage later. Quilra studied his reaction. She is slow. She won because the others spent too much early. Yes. Atroth watched Renee cross the final threshold while two competitors who had led for most of the trial struggled behind her. She knows her output. She is a search and rescue specialist. That explains the equipment habits. It also explains the pacing. A recorded interview began. A broadcaster asked Renee why she never seemed to push at maximum intensity. Renee wiped sweat from her face. Heroic exhaustion is usually just poor scheduling. Atroth made a low sound of amusement. Quilra did not. Is that common human doctrine? The liaison answered, in professions where exhaustion gets people killed, yes. That practical doctrine interested Quilra more than the stories. Competent humans did not regard fatigue as proof of virtue. Renee's qualification record made that philosophy concrete. She had withdrawn from one terrestrial endurance event years earlier after noticing early heat illness symptoms, despite being in position to place. Quilra found the incident buried in the medical notes. The human who would later argue to continue past 60 hours was not someone who habitually ignored safety. That contradiction would matter. They feared it, managed it, planned around it. That made the next part stranger. Because the human archive contained dozens of cases where people continued operating after every rule said they should have stopped. Chapter 3. The Human Stress Curve. Quilra performed Renee's pre-trial examination herself. Human baseline physiology was inelegant. That was her first conclusion. Drazhen stress regulation rose smoothly and plateaued. Their cardiovascular systems redistributed effort without violent spikes. Their tissue chemistry resisted prolonged metabolic disruption. Humans lurched between compensations. Heart rate climbed aggressively. Blood vessels constricted in some regions and opened in others. Stress hormones surged. Stored glucose mobilized quickly. Inflammatory pathways activated with distressing enthusiasm. Temperature regulation worked, but not beautifully. Quilra looked at Renee's cardiovascular model. Your species appears to solve problems by creating additional problems. Renee, standing inside the scanner, smiled. That tracks. You understand that is criticism. I've met humans. Quilra rotated the model. If a Drazhen maintains this level of stress chemistry for prolonged duration, protective inhibition begins before systemic injury. Sounds nice. It is. Renee stepped out of the scanner. What do we do? That is what I am attempting to determine. Human historical data did not help. There were too many variables. The archive included shipwreck survivors who stayed awake through storms, disaster workers operating through consecutive rescue periods, soldiers moving after severe sleep deprivation, explorers, firefighters, and parents trapped with injured children. People lost in wilderness environments who performed coordinated tasks despite hypothermia, dehydration, or exhaustion. Quilra distrusted the records. Survivors were remembered precisely because they survived. Failures were less visible. Instrumentation was poor. Descriptions relied on testimony. The continuance trial would be different. Unlike the old survival accounts, the trial could separate legend from physiology. Competitors were allowed brief recovery intervals but no true sleep cycle. They remained under observation continuously, and each species' medical team could stop participation regardless of score. Quilra considered that system conservative. It had been designed around species whose impairment and shutdown curves moved together. The trial would measure every heartbeat, temperature shift, cognitive error, and involuntary pause. Everything would be measured. Quilra entered her prediction before the event began. Renee would perform efficiently through the first 30 hours. After 40, human stress regulation would become increasingly costly. By 50, Atroth's superior metabolic control should dominate. By 60, Renee's cognitive deterioration should force withdrawal. Quilra believed the estimate conservative. Her model assumed human useful performance would deteriorate alongside human risk markers. If that relationship held, the intervention thresholds would catch Renee before judgment became dangerously unreliable. Quilra had no reason yet to suspect that retained procedural competence could outlast the very faculties needed to recognize its own limits. Then the championship started. Chapter 4. 30 Hours. Atroth dominated the first 10 hours. He moved a weighted rescue sled faster, completed the climbing section with less energy cost, solved the first navigation problem almost 2 minutes ahead. During the controlled grappling round, he put Renee on the mat twice before she scored a single positional point. Renee did not appear surprised. After the bout, Atroth offered his forearm in the Drazhen gesture of respect. "You gave up the center too easily." Renee accepted the gesture. "You're stronger than me. That does not require surrendering position." "No, but burning myself out trying to prove otherwise would be stupid." Atroth's eyes narrowed. Quilra saw the moment he stopped treating the human as merely durable. At 18 hours, he began watching her between stations. At 24, he altered his own recovery behavior. He sat when Renee sat. He drank sooner. He shortened unnecessary bursts of speed. Atroth adapted intelligently, and Quilra approved. The trial was designed to reward adaptation. He watched Renee waste less motion and changed his own behavior. Each competitor forced the other to reveal a different weakness. Renee could not match his power or precision, while Atroth could not assume his superior efficiency would automatically defeat someone who managed depletion differently. By hour 30, 7 competitors had withdrawn. Renee remained. So did Atroth. The surprise was not that Renee remained conscious. Several species could operate at 30 hours. The surprise was her performance relative to her medical data. She looked worse than Atroth, much worse. Her stress chemistry was elevated. Her heart rate took longer to recover after hard effort. Inflammatory markers had begun rising. Small tremors appeared in her fingers after precision tasks, yet her course times remained stable. Quilra compared the graphs. Something is wrong. The human liaison leaned over. With the sensors. With the relationship between damage and performance. He studied Renee through the observation barrier. "She doesn't look comfortable." "That is precisely my point." For most species, worsening biomarkers predicted worsening useful output with fairly clean consistency. Renee's body appeared increasingly unhappy. Her behavior had not received the message. Quilra entered a note. Potential mismatch between subjective impairment and retained procedural performance. At the next station, Renee finished a load transfer, placed both hands on her knees, and remained there breathing for almost 40 seconds. Then the signal sounded. She straightened, moved on. Atroth watched her go. For the first time, the champion looked curious. Chapter 5. 48 Hours. By 48 hours, the field was gone. Only Atroth and Renee remained. Atroth looked exhausted now, but his exhaustion was controlled. Renee looked ill. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her facial muscles had lost some of their usual expression. Fine motor tremor appeared whenever she tried to manipulate small objects. During a technical station, she reached for a locking tool, missed, looked at her own hand, tried again. Quilra felt unease. The human selected the correct tool, used it properly, then set it down. 30 seconds later, she stared around the workstation. "Where'd I put the torque key?" The device sat beside her wrist. She saw it, laughed. The laugh continued one beat too long, then she shook her head. "That's not great." Quilra agreed. The next station required route planning. Renee did something different. She stopped relying on memory. She touched each piece of equipment while naming it aloud. "Water, harness, marker, med kit, beacon." The broadcast commentator joked about humans talking to themselves. Quilra did not laugh. Renee was building external memory. That technique came directly from rescue work. Tired crews verbalized checklists, pointed at completed steps, paired equipment with physical locations, and repeated instructions because memory became less trustworthy before training vanished. Renee was not becoming smarter under exhaustion. She was replacing failing internal functions with structure. She repeated instructions back to the station computer. She marked completed steps physically. She checked her own work more often. Atroth noticed, too. The trial allowed the leading competitor to select between 2 challenge variants at several stages. Atroth chose the precision option. It was intelligent. Renee's tremor made fine tasks harder. He completed the station nearly 4 minutes ahead. Renee dropped a connector, had to kneel to retrieve it. When she stood, she swayed. Quilra's hand moved toward the medical control. Then Renee steadied, finished the task correctly. The human liaison said, "She's compensating. She is deteriorating." Both can be true. Quilra disliked how often humans said things like that. After the station, Atroth approached Renee during the recovery interval. "You could withdraw." "So could you." "I am leading." "Then seems weird you'd want me to." Atroth's mouth opened slightly. Renee smiled tiredly. "Come on, champ. You didn't get 11 titles by asking people nicely to stop." Atroth gave a low rumble. "No." "Good." The rest signal ended. They moved. Quilra watched Renee touch the equipment marker before leaving. External memory. Adaptation to impairment. The compensation was professional. What came later was something else. Chapter 6. 60 hours. At 60 hours, Quilra requested mandatory review. Renee sat in the medical bay with a thermal wrap around her shoulders and a hydration line attached to one arm. Her human physician reviewed the same data Quilra had. Neither liked it. Renee's reaction time had slowed. She had experienced one documented microsleep lasting slightly less than 2 seconds. Her temperature had drifted above baseline. Her stress chemistry remained elevated. Quilra stood in front of her. "I recommend withdrawal." Renee rubbed both hands over her face. "That bad?" "Yes." The human physician answered more carefully. "You're still technically inside the agreed intervention limits, but you're close." Renee nodded. She did not argue. That reassured Quilra. Then Renee asked, "How's Atroth?" "Better than you," Quilra said. "Rude." "Accurate." Atroth entered the medical threshold on his own review schedule. He looked tired but coherent. "End it jointly," he said. Renee looked up. "Would that make you champion?" "Under current scoring, yes." "Then no." Quilra's throat tightened. "That is not a medical argument." "No." Renee leaned back. "It's a competition. You are approaching dangerous impairment." "I know." "You may be unable to recognize when you should stop." "Which is why you're here." That answer prevented Quilra from becoming angry. Renee was not denying the danger. She trusted the medical rules. The rules still permitted continuation. Barely. Quilra looked at the human physician. He exhaled. "She has the right to continue under the current protocol." Quilra hated the current protocol. She authorized another 6-hour segment with increased monitoring. The authorization narrowed Renee's freedom rather than expanding it. Her next segment required continuous cognitive testing, no solo obstacle sections, automatic suspension after another microsleep, and a lower threshold for temperature or coordination decline. Quilra documented the decision herself because she no longer trusted the trial's standard human limits to be sufficient. Atroth bowed once to Renee. "Then I will not make it easy." Renee closed her eyes. "Would have been disappointed if you did." He left. Quilra remained. "Why?" Renee opened one eye. "Why what?" "Why continue when you know the medical risk?" Renee thought longer than Quilra expected. "Because I think I can still do the work." "That is circular. Rescue people say that too." Quilra did not know whether Renee was joking. As fatigue deepened, Quilra became less certain when Renee was joking. Chapter 7. The champion pushes back. Atroth attacked Renee's pacing. He had finally understood her greatest strength, so he removed rhythm. The next sequence alternated explosive tasks with precision tasks and rapid transitions, short load sprint, tool assembly, climb, navigation choice, controlled carry, balance problem. Every change required Renee's brain to switch context. At 64 hours, that became expensive. She lost the navigation task, not narrowly, badly. Renee selected a route, walked almost 200 meters, stopped and stared at a marker. Quilra saw confusion spread across her face. Renee turned around, returned to the decision point, checked the instruction again. She had misread one symbol. Atroth gained 6 minutes. At the load station, Renee stumbled. One knee hit the floor. She stayed there for 3 breaths before standing. At the climbing section, she missed a foothold and took a controlled fall against the safety line. The harness caught her. She hung there, her eyes closed. For a terrifying moment, Quilra thought she had lost consciousness. Then Renee muttered, "That was dumb." She climbed back onto the wall. Atroth finished the section well ahead. The champion had learned. Quilra respected him for it. He was not waiting for the human mystery to solve itself. He had found a weakness and exploited it. That choice also created the next stage of the contest. By attacking transitions, Atroth accelerated exactly the kind of cognitive failure Renee had been compensating for. Therefore, she simplified further, abandoning cleverness for rigid procedural loops. Atroth was winning the contest, but in doing so, he was forcing the human into the narrow band of behavior her most deeply learned habits could still support. The strategy worked. Renee's lead from early resource management disappeared. Atroth moved ahead. By hour 68, his advantage was substantial. Quilra expected Renee to withdraw. Instead, the human simplified further. She abandoned unnecessary conversation and improvisational tricks. She began treating every station like an emergency checklist. Her process became rigid: read, repeat, perform, verify, then move. Her speed dropped. Her error rate stabilized. Atroth noticed. He approached Quilra during a reset. She is worse. Yes. She is also harder to finish. Quilra looked toward Renee. The human sat against a wall with her head tipped back. Her eyes were closed. The reset timer sounded. They opened. She stood. Atroth watched. That should not still be enough. Quilra had no answer. Chapter 8. 72. The clock crossed 72 hours at 03:14 station time. Quilra remembered the exact minute for the rest of her career. Renee was halfway through a resource sorting task. Her hand stopped over a set of markers. She stared to her left. Nothing was there. "What do you see?" Quilra asked through the medical channel. Renee blinked. "Thought somebody moved." "No one did." "Yeah." She resumed. 30 seconds later, she froze again. This time her eyes closed. The sensor marked a microsleep. 1.8 seconds. Renee opened her eyes and looked confused. The marker she had been holding was now on the table. She stared at it, then at her hand. Quilra triggered medical suspension. Under the temporary conditions imposed at hour 60, that microsleep should have ended Renee's trial immediately. Quilra entered the course expecting no argument from the human medical team. The complication was that the episode had lasted below the emergency disqualification threshold written into the event charter, while the stricter condition Quilra had imposed applied only to the 6-hour monitored segment that had just expired. The rules had created a gap at exactly the wrong moment. The arena lights changed. Renee looked up. Quilra entered the course. "Renee, the trial is over." The human frowned. "No. You experienced another involuntary sleep episode." "Yeah." "You are experiencing perceptual disturbance." "Yeah." "Your temperature is elevated." "Probably." "You require sleep." "Definitely." Quilra stared at her. "How can you acknowledge every reason you must stop and still object?" Renee looked past her toward the far side of the course. Atroth had not completed the final sequence. His scoring lead was narrowing because he, too, had slowed. "I can still work." "That is precisely what I am questioning." Renee looked back. Her eyes had difficulty focusing. "I know." The human physician arrived. He reviewed the data. Quilra expected support. Instead, he said, "No hard stop yet." Quilra turned sharply. "She is hallucinating." "Brief perceptual distortion." "She is microsleeping." "Documented and dangerous." "And you will permit continuation." He looked unhappy. "For the final permitted sequence only under direct monitoring." Quilra understood the legal distinction. The current trial rules had not anticipated a competitor who could remain coordinated while objectively this impaired. The committee convened an emergency review beside the course. Nobody argued that Renee was healthy. The dispute was narrower: whether the medical staff could retroactively create a new automatic disqualification standard after she had completed the monitored segment. The human physician recommended stopping. Renee requested the final sequence. Quilra hated that the event rules made those two positions legally compatible. The committee could stop the event, but the human remained just inside every mandatory withdrawal threshold. Quilra hated the situation. Renee stood, slowly. "I can do one more." Quilra wanted to say that humans had clearly built their entire species around bad ideas. Instead, she authorized the final sequence. She did so under conditions harsher than any previous continuance final. Direct physician presence, no unsupervised climbing, immediate termination for another microsleep, loss of orientation lasting more than a few seconds, dangerous temperature rise, collapse without rapid recovery, or failure to respond correctly to a medical command. Renee would not be allowed to willpower her way through a hard stop. The problem was that she had not crossed one yet. Then she ran to the medical observation chamber, because Renee's biology had begun doing something she had never seen. Chapter 9. Fever Dream Protocol. The data looked wrong. Quilra's instruments were not revealing a secret reserve so much as the absence of a clean failure state. A Drazhen approached a coordinated protective shutdown. Renee's systems instead degraded at different speeds. Some cognitive functions were becoming unreliable while older motor programs, stress responses, and task habits still produced usable behavior. Stress chemistry that should have been falling toward shutdown remained active. Wakefulness signaling fought enormous sleep pressure. Glucose mobilization increased. Inflammatory signaling rose. Heat shock pathways activated as Renee's temperature climbed. Several regulatory systems began pulling in opposite directions. Quilra isolated the transcriptomic feed. Human gene expression had shifted. The shift involved no single gene but dozens, then hundreds of small regulatory changes. She created a temporary data folder. The naming field demanded an identifier. Quilra typed. The temporary folder needed a label for the cluster of heat, sleep pressure, stress chemistry, perceptual distortion, and stubbornly preserved task output. Irritated and frightened, Quilra typed. Fever Dream Protocol. It was not meant for broadcast. The media system saw the label anyway. Within minutes, commentators were repeating it across the station. Quilra barely noticed. She had expected a coordinated emergency state. What she saw was something messier. Some systems were preserving function. Others were causing damage. Pain modulation reduced the attention Renee gave to accumulating injuries. Inflammatory responses supported repair while increasing metabolic cost. Wakefulness networks resisted sleep while cognitive accuracy continued collapsing. Stress hormones maintained circulation and available energy while worsening strain elsewhere. The human body had not entered a superior mode. That distinction became the core of Quilra's later report. Renee was not stronger at 72 hours. She was worse at almost everything. The unnerving fact was that worse at almost everything still left enough familiar function for a narrow set of tasks. It had entered an argument with itself. Quilra whispered, "There is no protocol." The human physician beside her glanced over. "What?" "It is not coordinated enough." He looked at the data. "No." "Then why does it continue?" He watched Renee on the arena feed, because none of those systems evolved for this exact situation. Quilra felt something cold move through her. The human genome did not contain one elegant emergency switch. It contained many ancient systems, all trying to solve different immediate problems. The overlapping systems pushed in different directions. Stay awake, maintain blood pressure, release fuel, keep moving, mute some pain, manage heat, regulate inflammation, and repair damage. None knew when the others would stop. And Renee was still standing inside the overlap. The final course began. Atroth had also paid for 72 hours. His physiology had protected him better, but the same protection was approaching the threshold that had ended every previous challenger. Renee entered the final sequence cognitively damaged. Atroth entered it closer to an orderly shutdown. The contest had become a comparison between two very different kinds of failure. Chapter 10. The Final Course. Atroth entered first. The course began with unstable terrain, then a weighted rescue dummy, an extraction carry, and finally a limited contact control bout. He moved slower than at hour 20, still beautifully. His steps were deliberate. His breathing remained controlled. Renee entered 4 minutes later. She chose the wrong route immediately. Quilra saw it. Renee took 6 steps, stopped, looked at the marker, walked back, read it again. Left, she told herself, then went left. She reached the equipment rack, picked up a harness, dropped a strap, stared at it, picked it up. At the casualty station, Atroth used a technically superior lift. Renee did not attempt the same thing. She knelt, attached the drag harness, checked it twice, then began pulling. The dummy's weight should have been manageable for her under normal conditions. Now every meter looked difficult. Quilra watched her breathing. Too fast. Renee stopped, counted aloud to 5, continued. She reached the obstacle field. Atroth was already leaving it. Renee caught one foot, stumbled, recovered. At the extraction marker, she forgot to activate the completion beacon. She took 3 steps away, stopped, looked back, returned, pressed it. There was no speed, elegance, or reserve left, only correction after correction. Quilra realized the terrifying thing was not that Renee had stopped making mistakes. She was making more, she simply kept detecting enough of them to continue. Each correction cost time, which is why Atroth still reached the control arena first. But the errors also demonstrated why raw cognitive testing had underestimated Renee's remaining capacity. She could lose a step, catch the mistake with a checklist or environmental cue, and resume without reconstructing the whole task in working memory. Atroth reached the control arena. He sat during the permitted wait. Renee arrived several minutes later. She stood at the opposite boundary. Atroth rose. Even exhausted, he looked more stable. Atroth remained stronger and more precise. By every ordinary measure, he should win. Quilra knew it, Atroth knew it, Renee probably knew it. The champion looked at her. Stop. Renee blinked. Atroth stepped closer. You have nothing left to prove. She swayed slightly. He repeated the sentence he had spoken a year earlier. Eventually, the body tells the truth. Renee stared at him, then her mouth moved. Mine's been screaming for hours. The signal sounded. Chapter 11. The body tells the truth. Atroth attacked first, not cruelly, correctly. He closed distance before Renee could establish position. One arm controlled her shoulder, the other captured her hip. He turned. Renee hit the mat, hard. Quilra flinched. Renee rolled onto one side. For a second, she did not move, then she pushed up. Atroth waited. The rules allowed the bout to continue. Renee stood. Atroth caught her arm during the next exchange. He moved behind her, applied controlled pressure. Renee reacted late, too late. She turned toward the wrong side first, corrected, lost position. Atroth forced her toward the boundary. Renee planted one foot, framed against his chest. Instead of trying to outmuscle him, she dropped her weight. The response was simple and ugly, but effective enough to stop the next step. Atroth shifted. Renee lost balance. The boundary alarm sounded, reset. She returned to center. Quilra watched her neurological feed, reaction time deteriorating. Higher-order decision latency increasing. But familiar motor patterns remained. Renee's grappling background had been documented before the trial. The relevance was not athletic brilliance. Under severe sleep deprivation, novel strategy and fast decision-making were deteriorating, but heavily practiced movement patterns remained comparatively accessible. The same principle that let a rescue worker follow a drilled evacuation sequence. While exhausted now, let Renee produce a few simple grappling responses, without inventing them in real time. Her grappling background was recreational rather than elite, but years of repetition had made the movements deeply learned. Now those movements were surviving after more complicated thinking began to fail. Atroth shot for another control. Renee did not counter quickly. She countered simply. She answered with a forearm frame, a hip turn, and body weight. The movement seemed almost detached from conscious strategy. Atroth broke through and threw her again. Renee landed badly on one shoulder. She cried out. The medical system flagged the impact. No fracture. The referee asked if she could continue. Renee nodded. Atroth's eyes narrowed, not contempt, concern. You should stay down. Renee did not answer. She stood, slower this time. One knee shook. She used her own thigh to push herself upright. Quilra looked at Atroth. The champion's expression had changed. He had spent 11 years learning what exhaustion looked like. He knew when opponents were finished. Renee looked finished. Every part of her looked finished. And she was standing again. Chapter 12. It would not stop. Atroth increased pressure. He had no reason not to. Winning the bout required control, not injury. He moved Renee backward. She resisted. He changed direction. She stumbled. He caught her before she could fall outside the legal area and redirected her into the mat. Renee landed on her side, stayed down longer. Quilra watched the count. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3. Renee's fingers moved. She rolled. 4, pushed up. Atroth stared. The referee allowed continuation. Renee came forward. Renee did not come forward quickly, and that was what disturbed Quilra. There was no dramatic second wind, no sudden restoration. Renee looked worse every minute. She reached Atroth and wrapped both arms around his torso. The champion widened his stance. Normally, he would have escaped instantly. He tried. Quilra saw the first sign in his medical data. Protective inhibition. Drazhen's stress control had approached its upper threshold. The nervous system responded exactly as it was designed to. Voluntary force output dropped. The inhibition did not eliminate Atroth's voluntary force. It reduced it enough. Atroth froze. He knew. Quilra could see it in his face. His body had begun taking the decision away. Atroth had not become weak. His nervous system was deliberately reducing voluntary output before metabolic stress crossed into dangerous failure. That protective inhibition was the mechanism that had preserved Drazhen champions for generations. Against almost any equally exhausted opponent, it would also have ended the bout safely. He tried to explode backward. The movement was weaker than expected. Renee did not understand the physiology. She did not need to. She felt the failed escape. Her grip tightened. Atroth shifted again. Renee turned her hips. The movement was simple and practiced with no complicated setup. Atroth tried to plant his leg. Protective inhibition reduced the response. Renee turned him. They went down together. Atroth hit first. Renee landed across his torso. The champion bridged. Normally, Renee would have been thrown. This time his body refused full output. She settled her weight, captured one arm, moved her knee slowly, almost mechanically. Atroth's free hand pushed at her shoulder. His strength faded again. Quilra watched the Drazhen shutdown curve deepen. His body was saving him. Renee's body had not saved her yet. She pressed into the pin. Atroth waited half a second, then tapped. Atroth tapped once, twice, then a third time. Renee released immediately. The referee signaled victory. The arena erupted. Renee did not react. She remained kneeling. Atroth rolled onto his back, breathing hard. Renee looked toward the scoreboard. Her eyes did not seem able to focus. Then she sat down. Quilra was already running. Chapter 13. The cost. Renee remained continuance champion for 6 seconds before collapsing. Quilra reached her before her head struck the floor. The human was burning with heat. Her pulse raced. Her muscles trembled uncontrollably. Renee. No response, Renee. Her eyes opened. Did he tap? Yes. Okay. Then they closed again. Medical teams transferred her immediately. Treatment began immediately with cooling, fluids, electrolyte correction, neurological monitoring, and injury scans. There was no celebration, interview, or victory lap. Atroth walked to the medical bay under his own power 20 minutes later. His physiology had protected him. Once shutdown signaling reduced voluntary output, his stress systems fell rapidly toward recovery. He was exhausted, but comparatively stable. Renee slept. Not normal sleep at first, medically monitored. Her body continued correcting the consequences of the previous 3 days. The medical team treated dehydration, inflammatory load, metabolic depletion, muscle damage, a minor shoulder injury, bruising from the final bout, and a strained wrist. None individually catastrophic, together significant. Quilra stood between the 2 recovery rooms. Atroth woke after several hours. Renee did not fully. The Drazhen champion looked through the glass. She won. Yes. She looks dead. She is not. Atroth's throat moved. My body stopped me. Yes. Hers did not. Not soon enough. Atroth looked at Quilra. For the first time, the champion seemed to understand that his own shutdown mechanism was not defeat. It was protection. Renee's victory had come from a missing kindness in her physiology. Quilra eventually revised that thought. The human body did possess protections: sleep pressure, pain, fatigue, confusion, reduced precision, and the eventual certainty of collapse. What it lacked was the Drazhen's single decisive shutdown. Human safeguards could warn, degrade, and sometimes overpower intention, but under the wrong circumstances they could also be bypassed piecemeal for dangerously long periods. Quilra did not know how to feel about that. 3 days later, Renee woke properly. Her first coherent question was whether she had won. Her second was whether she had injured Atroth. Quilra answered both. Renee closed her eyes. Good. Quilra assumed she meant Atroth was uninjured. Possibly she meant the championship. With humans, both remained plausible. Chapter 14. There is no protocol. Quilra spent the next month searching human DNA. She expected architecture. Quilra expected one regulatory cluster, one coordinated switch, some buried evolutionary emergency system that explained everything. She found nothing of the kind. Instead, she found old mammalian stress pathways interacting with wakefulness regulation, hormonal responses, pain modulation, glucose control, inflammatory signaling, thermal response, and habit memory. Dozens of systems interacting. Some helped, some hurt, some did both depending on duration. The human physician reviewed her findings. He stopped at the dataset title, Fever Dream Protocol. Yes. He looked at her. That's not a protocol, that's a medical emergency. Quilra folded her hands. She won. Those statements aren't mutually exclusive. He continued reading. Quilra said, I expected a coordinated genetic mechanism. You've met biology before, right? She ignored that. then there is no hidden survival program. Not in the way you're looking for. He enlarged one of the regulatory models. You've got overlapping systems, stress responses, wakefulness, pain, metabolism, training, habit, motivation. None of them is designed to run 72 hours straight. And yet they did. Badly. Quilra considered Renee's final bout. The late reactions, the dropped equipment, the hallucinations, the microsleeps, the shaking hands. Yes. That's the part everybody keeps missing. He closed the dataset. She didn't become better. She became less impaired than she needed to be for just long enough. Quilra understood. The human body had borrowed function from future recovery. That metaphor was not literally metabolic accounting, but Quilra kept it because it captured the clinical truth. Renee had maintained useful output by accepting mounting error, stress, inflammation, heat, tissue damage, and sleep debt that would all require payment after the event. The function was real. So was the bill. The bill arrived later. But in the arena, later had been enough. Chapter 15. Monsters. The galaxy hated nuance. Within days, the phrase fever dream protocol escaped medical channels. News programs showed Renee standing after the third throw. The broadcasts replayed the same clip repeatedly. Commentators described humans as sleepless predators. Commentators called humans persistence hunters, self-destructive endurance organisms, and biological berserkers. One broadcast asked whether human civilization had hidden a combat survival mutation. Quilra sent a correction. It was ignored. She sent another, mostly ignored. Then Atroth agreed to an interview. That changed things. The champion sat beneath the continuance emblem, still thinner than before the trial. A reporter asked whether he believed the human victory had been fair. Yes. Do you consider human physiology dangerous? Atroth thought, all physiology is dangerous in the wrong context. The reporter persisted, are humans monsters? Atroth looked toward Quilra, who stood outside camera range, then back to the reporter. No. The reporter began another question. Atroth continued, but if one is still moving after it should have stopped, believe it. The clip spread everywhere. Quilra disliked the melodrama. She also understood what he meant. Do not assume continued movement means health. Do not assume pain means surrender. Do not assume visible impairment means incapacity. And most importantly, do not assume a human knows exactly when willingness has outlasted safety. That lesson changed the continuance trials. The committee's review concluded that the central failure had not been Renee's stubbornness alone. The medical framework had assumed that a competitor who remained responsive and procedurally competent still possessed enough judgment to weigh continuation rationally. Humanity had broken that assumption. Therefore, willingness could no longer substitute for neurological safety criteria. Chapter 16. Revised Medical Doctrine. The new human endurance rules were unpopular, especially with humans. The revised rules increased mandatory sleep windows, made microsleeps hard medical stops, required automatic review for perceptual disturbances, and prevented self-reported willingness from overriding objective neurological impairment. Renee objected to the wording. She was sitting in Quilra's office when she read the final version. Human willingness is not evidence of safe capacity, really. Yes, that sounds insulting. It is medically necessary. Renee kept reading. Continued human movement must not be interpreted as evidence that the human is medically fit to continue. Yes, people are going to put that on shirts. Quilra stared. Why? Because they're people. Renee became the first human continuance champion. She also testified in favor of the new hard stops once the wording changed. Renee told the committee that being able to complete a checklist at hour 72 had not meant she was competent to decide whether another hour was safe. That distinction became part of the final doctrine and mattered more to Quilra than the championship record. She refused to defend the title under the old format. Renee's refusal surprised Quilra. You objected to the new rules. I object to the wording. You agree with the substance. Of course. Renee looked almost offended. I was hallucinating. Quilra said, you argued to continue. Yeah. That is exactly why the rule exists. Renee considered, fair. Atroth remained formally recognized as the greatest Drazhen competitor in the trial's history. He did not lose prestige. If anything, the final made his 11 championships more impressive. He had pushed a human rescue specialist past every known endurance record and forced the galaxy to rewrite medical doctrine. Quilra considered that a respectable loss. Renee called it a really stupid 3 days. Quilra had learned enough about humans to suspect the phrase contained pride. Epilogue. What do humans call it? Renee returned to the Continuance Medical Facility 6 months later, fully recovered. Her laboratory values had normalized and the injuries had healed, but fully was doing the same kind of work humans often asked that word to do. Renee still had gaps in memory from the final hours, and for several weeks after discharge, she had needed unusually long sleep and reduced training loads before feeling normal again. Mostly. She still remembered the final hours in fragments. Renee remembered the final hours only in fragments. The wrong route, the weighted dummy, Atroth's hands on her shoulders, the floor, standing, the floor again, and then waking in medical recovery. Quilra showed her the original dataset. Renee stared at the title, Fever Dream Protocol. Yes, you called it that. It was descriptive. It sounds like I turn into a werewolf. Quilra paused. What is a werewolf? Never mind. Atroth arrived during the conversation. He had recovered completely. The two competitors had developed a relationship Quilra found difficult to classify. They insulted each other frequently. They also exchanged training data. Humans apparently considered this friendship. Atroth looked at the dataset. The galaxy still calls it that. Renee groaned, I know. Atroth sat across from her. What do humans call the fever dream protocol? We don't. There must be a term. Sleep deprivation, stress response, delirium, bad decisions. Atroth looked dissatisfied. What happened to you at 72 hours? Renee thought. Quilra watched her smile. I got tired. Atroth stared. Renee's smile widened slightly. Very tired. Quilra closed the dataset.